With 2 different trilogies and a bunch of solo movies, it's not easy to keep track of the X-Men movie canon. After Wolverine changed the future in Days of Future Past, we're deep into a new series of events.
Will you do nothing?
Now that Logan's come out, we have even more questions about how the X-Men timeline, or timelines, unfold.
McAvoy or Stewart? These timelines are so confusing.
To make this easier, let's call the first continuity Timeline 1, and anything after Days of Future Past is Timeline 2. Events that occurred before 1973 are the original timeline. Okay, let's sort this out. First up is First Class. Set in the 1960s, First Class occurs before the timelines divide in Days of Future Past. This movie tells the origin story of Charles Xavier, Magneto, Mystique, and how the X-Men were first formed.
You're not scared of me? I always believed I couldn't be the only one in the world.
Okay, this is a tricky one. Any scenes set before 1973 take place in the original timeline. Anything that happened after the 70s takes place in the first X-Men timeline, the one that was rewritten in Days of Future Past. Confused yet? Let's jump ahead to the first timeline we saw, in the form of the first X-Men trilogy. Taking place in the year 2000, X-Men tells the story of how Wolverine came to join Professor X's team and stop Magneto's plan to turn every human into a mutant, or kill them, depending on how strong their genes were. It's a classic of the genre, beginning a bold new X-Men trilogy that would later be erased by Days of Future Past. The second X-Men movie features the team making an uneasy alliance with Magneto's Brotherhood of Mutants, and we learn more about Wolverine's origins at Alkali Lake. At the end, Jean Grey taps into the full extent of her powers and appears to sacrifice herself to save the team. Tied with Origins Wolverine as being the most hated X-Men movie, Last Stand was inspired by the comics' Dark Phoenix saga, as Jean Grey loses control of her powers and her sanity. This movie featured several mutants losing their abilities, thanks to a mutant cure.
The transformation can be a little jarring.
Luckily, the Days of Future Past reset erased this from history. However, there's one movie left to go before we get there. Set in 2013, this movie takes place in the original timeline, as Logan journeys to Japan and encounters an old ally while recovering from the trauma he experienced in Last Stand. It's also worth mentioning that the flashback scenes to World War II take place in the original timeline. It's quite easy to distinguish between the 2 timelines in this movie. Anything that takes place in 2023, as the mutants battle the Sentinels, is Timeline 1. This horrible fate is why Kitty Pryde sends Wolverine back to 1973, to stop Mystique from assassinating Trask. He succeeds, Mystique is considered a hero instead, and the timeline is forever changed. A sequel to Days of Future Past, this movie follows Charles Xavier as he founds his school for gifted youngsters, teaming up with Mystique to stop the powerful ancient mutant apocalypse from bringing about, well, the apocalypse. Bringing us back to present day as Deadpool, as Wade Wilson tries to cure his cancer and get his best girl back from his worst enemy. It's fun, it's violent, and best of all, Deadpool's just as confused about these pesky timelines as we are.
You'll recover, Wade. You always do.
Set in 2029, Logan seems to take place in the bleak future of Timeline 2. However, Xavier references events from the very first movie, which takes place in Timeline 1. To make matters more confusing, Hugh Jackman described Logan as taking place in an entirely new timeline. However, director James Mangold later clarified Jackman's statement, explaining that the actor was referring to tone and suggesting that Logan actually takes place later on in Timeline 2. This would imply that the events of the original X-Men trilogy did happen, but not exactly as we remember them. With its depressing outlook on the future of mutant kind, we can only hope that Logan isn't the end of the road for the X-Men timeline, but only time will tell.